Earlier on, you said as well, Alex, that you can't call the death of someone's father a tragedy if you're a Christian, because it can't be a tragedy if God has some greater purpose in mind. But presumably, Bishop Barron, you would say tragedy exists for Christians, even if we do believe there's an ultimate,
Yeah. Well, again,
reason.
we're probably equivocating a bit. I mean, I would subscribe to Dante's. We're ultimately dealing with a divine comedy. So in that grandest possible sense, there's no tragedy. I'm dealing with a comedy, finally. But sure, within that, sure, from our perspective, we can identify something as tragic or deeply sad or wicked. But God's perspective, God is not one fussy competitive object among many. God's not one little fussy cause among many, but God is ipsum esse, more like the author of a novel than a character in it, right? And so Dostoevsky allowing all sorts of darkness within his great novels, but still having a commanding viewpoint. And it's an analogy that limps, like all analogies, but God's more like that than one fussy character among many within the novel.
Well, yeah, I mean, when Dostoevsky allows a character to be mistreated, it's certainly good for the plot line, but it's not good for the character. And that's the point here. The Christian, at least the theodicy that's been proposed here, is one saying that, evil is allowed because some greater good can be brought from it, which means the corollary of this is that any time an evil exists, any time bad exists, it exists precisely because some good is going to be brought out of it. That is to say, evil is actually an indication that something good is happening, which means that all of these evil instances, and I specifically avoided using instances that have the complication of free will, so I wouldn't use something like the Holocaust, but I use something like the coronavirus or something like a miscarriage. The implication of this, the implication of saying that evil is always an indication that some good is being obtained, is to say that these are things worth celebrating. Any time that one of these things happens, any time that a tragedy, and of course you can see it as an emotional tragedy, a Christian is still perfectly entitled to say that they're upset by this, that they're sad, that they're angry, that they don't understand the reasons, but ultimately philosophically they have to say this is a cause for celebration. Thank goodness that this has been allowed to happen so that we can draw out some good. Thank goodness that this 100,000 people in the United Kingdom have been killed by this virus so that some good can be achieved.
That's an emotional appeal, though, Alex. I don't think that's right. I mean, the Christian would look gravely at the situation and acknowledge God's will is at work here, though I can't see it. I mean, I think that's the right attitude. To say I would celebrate it seems to me the wrong point of view. You'd look at it and acknowledge there's a dimension to this that I can't fully appreciate. I place it within the context of God's ultimate purposes. But I do so, I mean, obviously in a very grave manner, typically in the presence of great suffering. So I wouldn't say that we can celebrate it, but
we can, of course, we can have grave celebrations, right? I mean, would you not say that God's will being done to produce good ends is worth celebrating? Of course, if God's will is being done to produce a good end, that's something worth celebrating. Now, in the same way, if we win a war, if we win World War II, we celebrate that happened, but it's a kind of solemn celebration because we recognize the cost that was paid. But it's still a celebration. It's still a good thing that we won that war. If evil is actually an indication of God's will being done by the procurement of some good through some evil, then as solemnly as that celebration may occur, it should have to be something worth celebrating, which seems to me totally anathema to the way that any person could, let alone should, entertain these kinds of tragedies.
Now, I would say you put it within the context of God's will and God's purpose, and you do so in the right spiritual frame of mind. But I wouldn't speak of celebration. It's an acknowledgement of God's sovereignty, if you want. God's sovereignty over creation.
I suppose, I mean, my thought on this, Alex, is that even Jesus in the Gospel of John weeps at the grave of Lazarus shortly before he brings him back from the dead. So there's a sense in which I don't see the Christian story as negating the fact of tragedy, even in the context of believing that there will be some greater good that ultimately comes out of it. I suppose this is the practical dimension for me, and I do want to kind of move us here, which is if you're saying, Alex, Bishop Barron and Christians in general have should frame suffering within the context of a greater meaning and a purpose that God may have, even though, as Bishop Barron says, they may not always see that. I suppose I would want to kind of put the challenge to you as well. Where does the atheist go with that? Because at one level, is it arguably the suffering and pain and evil in the world, there cannot be any meaning to it. It is in a sense meaningless because it is just the way the world is. There isn't going to be any final consolation, any justice, any ultimate, making sense of this. It just is what it is, and that is our lot, whatever life has thrown at us.
Well, allow me to answer both of your points there. The first point about Jesus weeping, don't misunderstand me. It's certainly compatible with the kind of, I suppose you would see it as a caricature of the Christian position, but if that were the position, it's certainly compatible with it to cry, to be sad, to be upset. The archetypal example here, I think, would be the crucifixion. If you were present at the crucifixion, it was a horrific, tragic event. Everybody's weeping, everybody's crying, apart from the people initiating the thing, of course. Jesus is suffering. It's a horrible, horrible event. And yet it's still celebrated in the modern day. It's celebrated on Good Friday because we recognize that, it's a tragic event that's worth weeping over, but ultimately speaking, because this brought about the greatest good, it's worth celebrating this solemn and tragic event. And that's what I'm talking about. Your father dying or of coronavirus or something, you can weep. You can weep and weep and weep. But as a Christian, you have to deep down accept that it's worth it, that this is a good thing, that I'm glad that God's will is being done here. Because otherwise you're saying that you're not glad when God's will is being done, which seems to be out of character for a Christian. I would just add that you're perfectly entitled to ask, well, what kind of consolation does the atheist give? I remember when Christopher Hitchens was asked this question on stage, he was asked, listen, what would you say to a friend who was dying on their deathbed? And his response was to say, well, funnily enough, I'm not usually the one they ask to come along and offer that.
Offer the last rites at the deathbed.
I think,
no.
I think I would have to plead the same, which is to say, look, I don't know what I would say to a friend who's dying, right? I really don't know. And I don't claim to have an explanation for why this is happening. I don't claim to have an answer to how justice will be served. But the one thing I won't do is offer false consolation to my dying friend. That's the one thing I won't do. Unless I'm certain and I'm able to say, listen, I know why this is happening. Don't worry. You can relax. Everything's going to be okay. If I don't have philosophically sufficient grounds to say that, then it would be not just foolish, but malicious of me to lie to them. And I'm not accusing Christians of lying, but I'm saying that if you're going to make that claim, you better be sure that you're philosophically justified in doing so. And as far as the responses to the problem of evil that I've generally seen entertained by Christians, it doesn't even come close.
Can I respond just a little bit? Because actually, I'm changing my mind, I suppose, a little bit with the word celebration. Because when you said celebration, I thought immediately of, well, put on a party hat and let's throw confetti. We'll have a celebration because your dad is dying. But the very fact that we talk about the Mass being celebrated, and the Mass is nothing but a representation of Calvary. So indeed, it is Good Friday represented, and we're celebrating the Mass, or the celebration of the Good Friday service. But we're a long way from party hats and confetti. We're celebrating, but the kind of beautiful solemnity and grandeur and deep sadness of that Good Friday celebration, that would signal the right Christian attitude. So I'm okay with that. We're celebrating it. It's not party hat celebration. It's this, think of the Good Friday liturgy as the way a Christian would celebrate suffering, I'm glad we kind of bridge that gap there. I would just add, though, that the implication of this is to say, you can imagine, as you say, celebration, we shouldn't really be thinking about someone throwing a party. Yeah. But imagine, that in 10 years' time, we all get together to celebrate the coronavirus. And don't worry, we're not throwing a party, we're not making cakes and wearing party hats, but we all get together in a room and we say, thanks be to God for blessing us with the coronavirus. It would seem absurd. It would seem absolutely insane if that's what we were doing. But that's the view that's implied by this theodicy, which is to say that maybe not the kind of celebration that involves a party hat, but the kind of celebration that involves us being able to get together and say, thank you, God, for allowing this to happen. I don't know who in their right mind could possibly thank God for the coronavirus. I think what's undergirding your analysis here is